Doug Tallamy is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored over 100 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 45 years. His books include Bringing Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope, and some classics such as The Nature of Oaks and his latest book, How Can I Help? His presentation today asks, what is the ecological potential of mini forests? Urban centers have never been seriously considered for conservation, yet evidence is mounting that urban restoration and mini forests can meet essential ecological goals. We're delighted to have you with us today, Doug.
Okay, let's talk about the role mini forests could play, what their potential is. I can relate it to our nonprofit Homegrown National Park, but really we're talking about a global issue, and that is the biodiversity crisis. You all know that we've got a biodiversity crisis, and we've got a biodiversity crisis because we humans have not shared our spaces with other living things. And if we didn't need those other living things, that'd be one thing. But we do, we can't exist on the planet without them. So it's a serious issue. And we tend to develop spaces that exclude nature. So, for example, there's very little that can live in a typical residential landscape like this. And we've got 135 million acres of residential landscapes like this in the US, which is 5 times larger than all the land managed by the National Park Service combined. And we're not through. We're still developing 800,000 new acres, typically taken from natural areas to residential landscapes. And it's one of the reasons we see these scary headlines on a regular basis. The insect apocalypse is here. We've got global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. Recent studies showed that we've lost 22% of our butterflies just since the year 2000, and they weren't doing that well in the year 2000. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is gone. 40% of the Earth's plants face extinction. The UN is predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years, and they made that prediction 3 years ago. Now, that is a prediction. It hasn't happened yet, and we have to make sure it doesn't, because again, those are the species that run the ecosystems that we humans all depend on. Now, this is where our national parks are located, the dark green areas. It's not very much space. About 3.6% of the US is in the national park system. Only 12% is federally protected, which is below the average of many other countries. We have land conservancies, and we've got other forms of preserves. But the big question is, why aren't these parks and preserves enough to sustain the biodiversity that we humans need? And there's several answers to that, but the big one is that they're too small. They are too small. When you take a large area like this, a large habitat like this, and you shrink it down to a little tiny habitat, and that's an exaggeration, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem, because small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why is that? It's because all populations fluctuate. Good times they go up, bad times they go down. If you're a large population like this top line here, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population, you often fluctuate and hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch, and unless you recolonize that patch, you're permanently gone. That's called local extinction. And studies all over the planet, some of them more than 100 years in length, are telling us the same thing. We have not preserved enough of the natural world to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need. Decades ago, Edwin Way Teale said that we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's the most basic common sense. So what shall we do? Well, there's a lot of suggestions out there. E.O. Wilson read an entire book about what we need to do called Half Earth, published it in 2016. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on the planet, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere. And that includes humans. Makes it a pretty important issue. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend any time telling us how we were going to save life on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the earth aside and everything that's in trouble can be in that half. We'll be in the other half and it'll be great. But of course, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And I don't see that diminishing anytime soon. We got 8.2 billion people, along with all of our hardscape, our roadways, our airports, our detritus. In the other half, we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? Well, I think we can. I think we can. I think we must. But we need a new approach to conservation to do that. We have got to give up the idea that humans and nature cannot coexist. We've had that idea forever. But not only is living with nature an option, is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and save nature where there are a lot of people. So we're not just going to save nature in pristine areas. We're going to save it here. But uh-oh, there's nothing there. That means we got to go beyond conservation to restoration. We have got to put natural systems back from our cities. Even, it doesn't have to be cities. We got to put it back everywhere, but we're not going to ignore cities. And that means we need to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Now, we hear a lot about habitat fragmentation as the main problem. We do have these little habitats that we've left here and there. They're all small. They're all isolated from each other. And one of the problems is they suffer from inbreeding depression, meaning the individuals in here end up being closely related, then they breed with each other, and that leads to genetic issues. So the suggestion has been to build biological corridors that connect these isolated habitat fragments with each other so plants and animals can move back and forth, and inbreeding depression is less of a problem. But the main problem persists. They're still small habitats. So when the populations fluctuate, those populations will disappear over time. So I think we have to go beyond biological corridors. We got to put the plants back in between viable habitats. We've got to recreate viable habitats in what is now no man's land. This is better. This is even better. Now, if you picture each one of these dots, a Miyawaki forest or a tiny forest, then you get the picture. We can put these plants back pretty much anywhere. That's the beauty of the tiny forest method. So this is where we can talk about Homegrown National Park. Again, we're a small nonprofit, homegrownnationalpark.org, and our goal is to convince people to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves. And most of the time, that's going to be on our private property. You can go to our website. You can register your mini forest on our map. This is the biodiversity map. You put down the location and the amount of area that you are restoring, and your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. He's our little emblem there. And of course, the goal is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Our mission is very simple. We want to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity, by planting the native plants that support it, by removing the non-native plants that do not. And we're trying to build a culture that's sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are important ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park or associated with any effort to put the plants back. There's a significant increase in biodiversity. There's a measurable reduction in invasive species. Most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If everybody got rid of the invasive plants just on their property, we'd be 85% done in the east. Not totally done, but it's a good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn, which is what most of us landscape with, is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. So if we replace it with anything else, particularly a mini forest, we're going to sequester a lot more carbon, and we're going to hopefully create viable habitat in between parks and preserves. Any bit of viable habitat we create outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. In my view, equally important are the sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and that is national awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We want to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, whether you like it or not. But I think that makes everybody responsible for sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations, from Audubon to National Wildlife Federation to Wild Ones to Sierra Club to all the land conservancies. We want to get them onto one map, the visual biodiversity map, so we can see how we're doing. Did I mention that it's free? Homegrown National Park is free because we're not competing with other organizations. We want to be a movement that promotes all of them together. But there is urgency in enacting the Homegrown National Park solution. Remember the 135 million acres of residential landscape out there? It's a big job, so we all need to get to work, but we have to know what it is we're supposed to do if we're going to succeed. Well, there's 4 ecological responsibilities that every piece of land out there has, every single property, whether you're in an urban center or not. Every landscape has to support a food web. If you don't have a food web, you don't have animals. If you don't have animals, you don't have a viable ecosystem. Every landscape has to sequester carbon to help climate change. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies, and every landscape has to support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things, which is why you hear me picking on it all the time. We need to reduce the area that's in lawn. Which plants should we replace our lawn with, or should we make sure are part of our plantings? Well, there are 3 kinds of plants out there, plants that we call contributors. Remember, plants are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into food, into simple sugars and carbohydrates. That is the food that supports just about all the animal life on the planet. So plants that contribute the most food we'll call contributors. There are plants that don't contribute food, so we'll call them non-contributors, and they're plants that actively remove energy, remove food from viable food webs. The very best contributor around the country is one of our oaks. In 84% of the counties in which they occur, they're contributing more energy by far than any other plant genus. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant, has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not contributing any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be any of our ornamental plants that don't support the food web, but do escape into our natural areas, pushing out the contributing native plants. So the end result is a loss in energy from our food webs. What makes a contributor a contributor? Well, in terrestrial food webs, particularly in the temperate zone, it is plants that have the ability to support caterpillars. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't support a lot of caterpillars, then we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. And that's why what I call keystone plants are so important. They are the plants that support the most caterpillars. Remember what a keystone is. It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch, and if you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses. And that's because just 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So I like to think of the keystone plants in our any planting, and that includes mini-forests, as the 2x4s that are holding that ecosystem up. They're the support system. You cannot build an ecosystem out of wallpaper. And that is what we've been trying to do with our ornamental plants for the last century. How do you know what the best keystone plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder, National Wildlife Federation website, and put in your zip code, and the rank list of the most important woody and herbaceous plant genera in your county will pop up. So very quickly, why do native plants support the most caterpillars? Because most caterpillars are host plant specialists. They can only eat plants for which they have very specialized adaptations that help them get around the plant defenses that plants use all the time. And I'm going to use the monarch butterfly as a very quick example. We all know that monarchs are specialists on milkweeds, and we know that milkweeds are toxic plants. They're protected by cardiac glycosides and sticky latex sap. That's what gives milkweeds its name. When you break open a milkweed leaf, all this white goo comes out, and on exposure to air, it gels. It forms a chewing gum-like substance, and if it gets onto caterpillar mouth parts, then it glues their mouth shut. So how do monarchs eat milkweeds? Well, they crawl onto a leaf. They go to the end of the leaf and they start to eat. And if any latex sap starts to come out at all, they'll stop eating, turn around, go back up, and they start to chew through the midrib. And they chew and they chew and they chew until they've completely severed the midrib, blocking the flow of latex sap from this part of the leaf to this part of the leaf. Then they can turn around, go back down, and they can eat the leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. Very simple behavioral adaptation, which ends up flagging the leaves. You can find monarchs by just finding those flagged leaves. But those are the upsides of specialization. The monarch can use a plant that most other insects cannot use because they don't have the physiological and behavioral adaptations to get around those defenses. The downside is that now that's all monarchs can eat. They are locked into eating a single plant genus. Out of the 2,137 plant genera in North America, monarchs can only eat one, Asclepias, and they are not unusual. 90% of the insects out there have very specialized relationships with particular plants, just like the monarch. So when we're rebuilding, when we're restoring landscapes, we have to use the native plants that support those relationships because our insects have not been able to find or create new relationships with plants we brought in from other continents. That takes a very long time. So just to wrap up, theory predicts that if we build mini forests in as many places as possible, and we use the plants to support caterpillars, we really can reverse biodiversity declines. Now, it's true each mini forest is a tiny habitat, but we're going to get a lot of them together so that they kind of blend, and then it's not a mini habitat. And what we're going to find out the rest of this conference is how well that prediction holds up. How well are mini forests actually supporting the biodiversity that we need to restore? So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. I always enjoy hearing your presentation, and thank you for explaining how important the patches of nature right under our feet are, right? Not the ones out in the wilderness, the ones
They're
sticking up
important too,
between.
but yeah.
Yeah, those are important too, but there's only so much of that, right? No third Earth. All right, we are going to take a look at the questions from Q&A. If you haven't put one in yet, it's helpful if you can type the word question in front of your inquiry in all caps. That's helpful. And then please include your name in your message if you want us to include that. We'll not be able to unmute people to ask their questions verbally. We're just going to pull them all from the chat. So one of the questions that I get often in it's just a question I get often. We have a lot of people interested in pollinator gardens, and they know that we do mini forests. So if you might speak a moment about what kind of guidance to give people as when they're making a choice around, do I plant a pollinator garden, a mini forest, a hedgerow? How can you address that?
The two are not mutually exclusive. A lot of our very important pollinator plants are woody plants. Black cherry, willow, redbud. These are flowering plants, basswood. They're all helping pollinators enormously. We tend to think pollinator gardens are just herbaceous plants that flower during the summer, but they're certainly an important part of it. But the woody plants that we put in our mini forest can contribute as well, depending on which ones we choose. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you want blooming plants through all the seasons, from spring right through early fall. And that's why you've got to use both herbaceous plants and woody plants to achieve that. It's very difficult to achieve that in a very tiny space, but you can work at it anyway. And when you build a mini forest and it gets pretty dense in the middle, you still have the outside, which is exposed to sun. That's where you should focus your perennials, your annuals, things like goldenrod. Goldenrod's, it's the second most important pollinator plant. Well, it's the second most important keystone plant outside of woody plants. Supports more species of specialist bees than any other plant in this part of the country, followed by sunflowers. These are things that we need to get into our small plantings, but it doesn't mean if you can't have trees too.
I I couldn't agree more. And we're going to test that in a garden that we're planning right now for Belmont, Massachusetts, where we are handling the mini forest tree planting part of it. And the local native plant group is doing a pollinator border around it of more of the flowering plants. And I think that's going to be a great combination. But as you said, we'll see. Uh, we use the term pollinator garden, but I have heard you push back on that term occasionally. Do you want to say just a word about that? Because it is an interesting perspective.
Yeah, it's not that I'm pushing back. It's that I hear so much about pollinator gardens. I'm getting the feeling that the public thinks pollinators are the only important insects. That's what I'm pushing back on. Pollinators are enormously important insects. Without the pollinators, we lose 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. So we absolutely need them. But that allows plants to exist and make that food. If you don't get that food from the plants to animals, and most vertebrates do not eat plants directly, what are they eating? They're eating invertebrates. They're eating the insects that ate those plants and transfer them. So we need that intermediate too, and that's where those all important caterpillars come in. Now, fortunately, most caterpillars come from moths, and there are a good many moths who are excellent pollinators, particularly at night. So they're doing both. They're supplying the food web and pollinating plants. I just don't want people to think, well, if I save the honeybee, I've done it.
Right, right. I think it's a good educational point, right? And that's why I bring it up.
Right.
Um, Unfortunately, we won't be able to take any questions from the audience unless they are in the chat. We won't be answering any hands up. So thank you. Doug, could you speak to how soon after planting we can realistically expect to see functional signs of biodiversity, such as pollinator activity or herbivore plants? And additionally, when you assess ecological health in these early stages, what indicators would you prioritize, especially considering the functional activity of pollinators?
Well, you can expect contributions immediately. I have a picture. I just stumbled across it at my house of a pin oak. It's about 3 inches tall, has just germinated just above the leaf litter, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So it's contributing immediately. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your trees to start to contribute to that caterpillar biomass that's driving our food web. Let me just say briefly, why do we need those caterpillars? A single nest of chickadees requires 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch to the point where they leave the nest. That's one tiny bird, a third of an ounce. And all the birds are doing that. So we need thousands and thousands and thousands of caterpillars. We need the plants that make those caterpillars. How do I measure success? We've done this through literature host records. We've looked at records of which caterpillars are eating which plants over the last 100 years, and we've ranked them. That's what that native plant finder does. So you can look and see what the top ranked plants are. So where I live, mid-Atlantic states, oaks can support 557 species of caterpillars. So I know if I have an oak, I've got a top performer. Tulip trees support 21. So if I have a tulip tree, it's a great native plant and it supports the tulip tree, silk moth, and a few other things. But it's not a keystone plant. It's not a key contributor. If I have a tulip tree monoculture, it helps me, gives me a plan or a mechanism for increasing the diversity of that landscape just by knowing the ranking of these plants. So you don't have to go out and measure what they're actually doing. You just look at that list and we've measured it for you.
That sounds pretty handy. So we talk a lot about what happens above the ground. I have a very savvy question from Lee Rampey. Are there particular plants that support the underground ecosystem, the fungal network and microbes?
Yeah, I don't know. I do know that trees make leaves, and leaves make leaf litter, and leaf litter protects the moisture that protects all of the soil community. So, keeping the leaves on your property from whatever tree it was, and again, this is where oaks are superior because a single leaf can take up to 3 years to break down. So it forms that protective blanket over that all important soil community better than other trees. But in terms of plants that are supporting the soil community the best, yeah, you're beyond my knowledge. There may be, but I don't know.
Well, the next talk. So we have a couple of questions involving cultivars and nativars and asking uh, questions from Nicholas Guerin and Jared Ingersoll asking their role in supporting this food web and how you feel about them.
Okay, well, a cultivar is just a genetic variation of the straight species. A nativar is a word that the public made up. I used it once in a paper and they made me take it at. It's just a cultivar of a native plant. And cultivars are, we've had this idea that plants are just decoration. So we've picked the prettiest plants, the ones with the most attractive features, and put them in our nurseries forever. When the native plant movement took off, nurserymen said, well, we better make cultivars and native plants or people won't buy them. They still were hung up on the fact that plants are just decorations. There are cultivars that enhance particular valuable traits like disease resistance. Sometimes in small properties, you can't have a big tall plant. So with their dwarf varieties, those are cultivars that have been either found in nature, which really makes them varieties, or they were actively selected for. Are they as productive as a straight species? The short answer is it depends on what the cultivar trait is. Sometimes, for echinacea, they're what, a couple hundred cultivars. Are they all as good as a straight species? No, they're not, but some of them are. So how do we know? We have to do big trial gardens. I can say from research that we've done that when you take a green leaf and make it red or purple, you're loading the leaf with anthocyanins, and that is a feeding deterrent. So you've essentially ruined the contributions that the leaves of that plant can actually make. When you take a flower and you make it a double flower, you're turning the reproductive parts of the flower into petals. Very, very pretty, but totally non-productive for pollinators. But there are cultivars that are just as productive as the straight species. And if you want the very latest on results from trial gardens, go to the Mount Cuba Center website. Mount Cuba Center in Hockessin, Delaware. They have been doing trial gardens for several years now, and they have all the results of their comparisons. It's mostly for pollinators up on their website, so you can see what we know so far.
Thank you. We have a question from Rachel Summers and Valerie Nelson that I think go together. Seeing as the first one is, what do you see as the role of federal, state, and local governments when almost all land is privately owned? And I think a related question is how to connect money to pay private landowners to remove invasives because it's can be expensive and create incentives. And that is from Rachel Summers.
Right. Well, step one is to stop selling them in our nurseries, and states are taking the lead there. Delaware has banned the sale of invasive plants, and a number of particular species are banned in other states. It makes no sense to sell them and then spend zillions of dollars trying to get rid of them. But incentivizing, monetary incentives go a long way. So, for example, in California, they don't have the water for lawn, so they're giving people $3 rebates for every square foot of lawn that they convert to xeric plantings. Minnesota has a cost sharing program that is paying homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Pennsylvania started a similar program. Virginia's thinking about a similar program. So there are incentives that will encourage people. Not that you're going to get rich if you do this, but what it does is give you cultural permission. You can do it, and when your neighbor complains, say, "Hey, the state's paying me to do this because it's the right thing to do for watershed management, for biodiversity management," and that can be done.
Hello.
That can be done at all levels.
Thank you. I have a couple questions that go along the theme of, are all insects really good insects? And right now we're dealing with spotted lanternfly in many areas and, very actively trying to get rid of them or eliminate them. And so a question about what's the best way to go about that? And also someone mentioned, if your business is a fruit tree orchard and you can't give all the fruit to the insects, and what are some ways to deal with that?
Okay, are all insects good insects? Any insect that comes from another country and any invasive species insect, we'll just if we're gonna put good or bad labels on them, we'll call them bad. They are here without their natural enemies, not keeping them in check. Think of the gypsy moth, which is now the spongy moth. Think of the spotted lanternfly, the brown marmorated stink bug, the emerald ash borer, the hemlock woolly adelgid. Huge problems caused by invasive insects. So we're not trying to promote them. It would be wonderful if we never brought another one in. Um, but of course, people want anything that bites us, you want to label as bad. Mosquitoes, for example, they do transmit diseases, but mosquito larvae are an essential component of all freshwater aquatic ecosystems. You take away mosquito larvae, and you've just crashed the aquatic ecosystem. So, it's not black or white. Most of the pests in a fruit orchard are introduced pests. If you look at the list of things that hit apples, most of them are brought in. Apples themselves are brought in. It's not a native plant. So again, we're bringing in the pests, and now we're not trying to save them. I'll give you one bit of good news with the spotted lanternfly, and that is its populations seem to be imploding. Where it's been here the longest, they're crashing. On the outside of that donut, where it keeps expanding, then they go crazy for 2 or 3 years, but then they crash. We're not sure why, but it might be something you don't have to do anything about. Unless you're a grape or an apple grower, it's an issue the year that they're bad.
And do you have any advice for sustainable or healthy ways to deal with those insects that you do need to eliminate?
If they're eating your livelihood, um, yeah, then it gets to pest control for sure. Apple orchards, particularly for diseases, they have to spray on the calendar. And I've never been in agriculture. I haven't ever faced that. I do know that the homeowner uses far more insecticide than they need to. Um, if we see an insect, we tend to want to kill it, and that's unnecessary. The only insects you really need to control at home are termites. And then you call a professional who they now use baits that are very effective and use very little material. So it's not like the old days where we just sprayed DDT everywhere. But
Great
you want to
point.
minimize your use. Think about that global insect decline. Insects are the little things that run the world. If we kill them all, we're gone. Sounds dramatic, but that's the way it is.
And does that include mosquitoes?
That includes everything.
Just
Yeah,
had to
so
ask.
controlling mosquitoes at home, we talk about mosquito dunks. Mosquito foggers for adults. It's almost impossible to control adult mosquito populations. You have to kill more than 90% to get good control. Mosquito foggers kill about 40%, so they have to keep coming back and back and back. When they do that, they're killing all the other insects. They're killing your monarchs, they're killing their pollinators, they're killing all the natural enemies to keep things in check. So it's a booming business around the country that is not addressing the real problem, and it's causing huge problems. So you control mosquitoes in the larval stage. Mosquito dunk buckets is a good approach. I will say all species of mosquitoes don't go to those dunks. If you live next to a salt marsh, it's just the environment you live in. And you say, well, I'm going to eliminate the salt marsh. Okay, you can pave over the world and eliminate mosquitoes, but that's not the way it should be.
Well, and I think that's a good point that often they're advertised as only killing mosquitoes, but they really are killing off all the insects.
We're doing an experiment right now. I've got an undergrad we bought a mosquito fogging machine, and we spray vegetation, and then we test insects on it. She's up to 6 species now. Everyone dies within 24 hours.
Wow.
100% death. So it's not even nuanced.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I don't know if you have a quick answer to a question I think might be on a lot of people's minds. This is from Kelly Knight. In a typical city suburban yard, is it better to plant large patches of a few species or smaller amounts of many different plant species?
In a tiny area, I would say large patches of a few species. But you've got that entire city. This is where it's great to talk to your neighbors. So you don't all plant the same few species, and that's where you get the diversity. But in a small area, you cannot get all the diversity that we actually need. If you're trying to support the monarch, for example, one ramet of milkweed's not going to do it. You need a milkweed patch, or it's going to starve to death. So decide what it is you're favoring and focus on that. And then talk to your neighbor, get them to focus on something else.